The last section of lore that we translated was in Izalith, and what we learned there forever changed the way that I'll view it going forward. Back then, I also mentioned the Abyss and its creatures, and just like in Izalith, there's far more to these creatures than the English lets on. First, and most importantly, the Primordial Serpents. So the very name Primordial Serpent is perhaps more accurately translated as World Serpent, which is a really overt reference to the legendary world serpent Jormungandr of Norse mythology. Jormungandr is a child of Loki. He's a sea serpent that is so giant that his body encircles the entire earth. Actually, Chester also refers to the Primordial Serpents as giant snakes, calling them Orochi in the Japanese text. So they're the biggest snakes in From Software history. Well, they were. The imagery of a snake eating its own tail is an example of an Ouroboros, a symbol of wholeness, infinity, the universe, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And these are all concepts that fit really neatly with the so-called Primordial Serpents, because they're obsessed with the cycle of the world. And I think it's fair to take issue with the word primordial. This implies that they've existed since the beginning of time, but a couple of item descriptions actually suggest that serpents are derivative of ancient dragons. No. Instead, these world serpents are better seen as creatures that represent and understand the logic of the world.
I am the Primordial Serpent, Darkstalker Karth. I can guide thee and illuminate the truth. I am the Primordial Serpent, King Seeker Frampt, close friend of the great Lord Gwyn, chosen undead. I wish to elucidate your fate.
They are elders, sages who take up the role to inform and advise, respected for their profound knowledge of the universe, even if Karth and Frampt interpret that knowledge differently. Karth, the serpent found after defeating the Four Kings, believes,
Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature.
And when Karth talks about the quote-unquote course of nature, he's perhaps better translated as saying the world's logic. In Souls, this world's logic was supposed to be the fall of ancients to light, and the fall of light to dark. This is the logic of the world, and Karth and his ilk help us because they've come to understand that reality at its core. Therefore, Karth's retinue probably weren't always aligned with the dark. In fact, Karth, when he talks about Gwyn as if he was on a very personal level with him. He betrays his thinking, he betrays his secrets, and if Karth is indeed loyal to the world's logic as he says he is, then it follows that he was once all for Gwyn's Age of Light, and maybe he even encouraged Gwyn's war against the ancient dragons. The Age of Fire was clearly dawning, and back then it was only logical that it be dominated by beings of fire. But next, it was time for dark to prevail.
After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the three souls, but your progenitor found a fourth, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark.
That last line is actually incorrect. It suggests that the Age of Dark began once, but it didn't. Instead, in the Japanese text, it goes on to say, eventually fire goes out, and only dark remains. In that case, it would be an age of you humans, of dark. And it's true. Living is a weakness, and even the gods, who are persons of fire, are no exception to that rule. But this age never came to be, thanks to Gwyn. Lord Gwyn feared the logic of the world, so he made his own. This was the first sin.
Once, the Lord of Light banished dark and all that stemmed from humanity, and men assumed a fleeting form. These are the roots of our world.
Cursed with undeath and relying on kindling the fire to cure hollowing, man became intrinsically tied to Gwyn's Age of Fire. In time, many even came to believe in and love the cage of falsehoods that had been created around them.
Peace grants men the illusion of life. Shackled by falsehoods, they yearn for love, unaware of its grand illusion.
Gwyn even convinced a world serpent, Frampt, the Kingseeker, that he alone had changed the logic of the world. So you can imagine having a world serpent on his side would have lent a lot of credibility to his cause. And in a way, Frampt isn't wrong. Gwyn did do irreparable damage to the logic of the world. In retrospect, we realize that he ended up creating an Age of Fire so endless that it ended up burning the world down to ash without ever truly passing over to dark. Though Frampt does experience a lapse of faith when he witnesses the first Dark Lord depose Gwyn.
Let Karth and Frampt serve your highness.
In the Norse myths, Jormungandr, the world serpent, is mortal enemies with Thor, the god of thunder. You can see the parallels here. So too does Karth, the world serpent, undermine Gwyn, god of thunder's, rule in Anor Londo, and in Ulyssil as well. New Londo is of particular interest. The name New Londo is clearly derived from Anor Londo, and if we go off the Elvish Sindarin translation, Anor Londo translates to Sun Haven, making New Londo a sort of young, small haven. The four kings of New Londo were appointed by Gwyn, and they received fragments of his very own soul, and it's yet another example of Gwyn sharing his authority and his soul with others in his own self-interests. In addition to this point, the Japanese name of the four kings suggests that instead of kings, they're more like officials, or at least public kings, sort of ambassadors that were a part of Gwyn's overall plan for control. As for the ghosts in New Londo, they align with this common Japanese perception of evil spirits, resembling those who die in a really sudden or violent manner, people who are not properly respected after death. And, you know, the residents of New Londo were drowned en masse by the healers in their community, so they fit that criteria because those were supposed to be people they trusted. Even the mountain of corpses below release the heads of undead called a resentment or a grudge, which supports the idea that the residents are bitter and vengeful at how they were killed. It also explains how they were created and what a ghost really represents in souls. There was definitely a decline in New Londo's society after Karth introduced Life Drain to the Four Kings, but it's debatable whether it was actually Karth's intention to drag the city into the abyss. Because in the Japanese, Karth clearly states that they, meaning the Four Kings, failed him. He says, without understanding the value of truth, they were merely conceited in their power. He expected more from them. He expected them to pursue the truth, not just steal from others. And this same disappointment would apply to Manas's abyss in Ulyssil, really. While Karth definitely said to the Ulyssilians, hey, Manas is underneath your society and he's the origin of all humans, Goff himself admits that Ulyssil brought the abyss upon itself by defiling his grave. Karth didn't necessarily intend for them to dig it up and mess everything up. It's definitely clear that Karth was trying to learn about the world, and he made mistakes as he eventually worked towards his end goal of usurping the fire, and the most success that he had was when he created a Sable Church from the ground up with its own ideology and its own goal, instead of just relying on others. This was more successful. Karth worked until his dying breath, till the very end. In the Japanese, Yuria says,
Karth, I have failed thee.
He was as devoted to the world's logic as Gwyn was to defying it. And there's this great parallel with Norse mythology once again. Jormungandr and Thor, Karth and Gwyn, in both stories, both of them fall to one another at the end of the world. Both stories are identical in that way, which is maybe more than mere coincidence. In the end, the world's logic doesn't go from light to dark, it simply burns out, and ash inherits the world. And with that in mind, who knows what awaits us if Dark Souls 4 is ever made. I owe huge thanks for this video to Loki, who you've probably heard about by now. He's one of the best writers I've ever met. He was the translator who contributed much of the script this time around, and I won't have as much time for script writing in the coming months. I'm sure some of you know why. So instead of making no videos at all, I've simply asked for a little bit of help. I hope you guys don't mind. Thank you, Loki, and thank you, Parry God, for the footage, and thank you, as always, for watching. And I'll see you next time.